Zach, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, Jonathan. Thank you.
Good, good, good. So we decided to talk for a range of reasons, but one of them is that you've just produced a rather extraordinary essay that many people have already given very positive feedback about. Um, it's well, why don't we begin by just asking you what it's about, and we'll take it from there.
Um, well, I suppose it's about the current moment or the current situation. The genesis was that I've been reading a lot, as everyone is, of stuff online and was not finding a clear spiritual message, basically, or a
Right,
clear ethical message.
right,
Um, and uh, and so I was kind of like complaining about that, and my wife Megan, who's one of the smartest people I know, she's like, "You should write something then." And so I was like,
yeah,
"Oh, maybe I will."
yeah,
And so I sat down to write, and this is basically what came out.
right,
And I'm involved in conversations with Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall, which have me aware of a lot of like the meta-systemic and infrastructural and geopolitical and economic and mental health kind of dimensions of the whole thing. So I'm holding a lot. I'm in touch with a lot of people across different socioeconomic strata within the United States. And so I'm seeing a lot of suffering and pain. And so just I'm trying to think about what can be said,
right,
what can be said with a glad heart and that can be given as help. And so as an educator and philosopher, someone with an interest in psychology, I'm trying to do something helpful, aside from just talking to the people that I know, to try to send a positive signal that's not more confusion.
right,
And so that's basically what it is. And the substance of it is that, um, you know, psychologically, you are your world. Like you're embedded in your routines.
mhm,
All your skills are built in context, and all your personality traits arise in conversation and relation. And so, when the world changes drastically,
mhm,
and the normal scaffolds of yourself are kind of removed, then there's this opening for basically transformation and a kind of like opening to all of these archetypal and imaginal and fantasy and new ideals of the self and terrible worries about the self you never would have had. And so the imagination is ripped open when the world kind of comes apart. And so there's this sense of, when we think about the moment, there's so many issues with the body, right,
right,
and the biopolitical. But there's also this issue of the imagination and of identity. And so, to me, the metaphor that comes there is that, well, this is a war in heaven. This is in
right,
the noosphere. This is about the metanoic moment, right? The moment when the mind is forced to become something new.
mhm,
And that is a part of life. Like it's just happening to everyone all at the same time,
mhm,
which is to say that it happens repeatedly over the life course, that things occur in one's context that make the identity kind of have to change and transform very drastically.
mhm,
Moving, a spouse dies, a parent dies, these things are coming upon you, and kind of there's a need to change the self. And in those moments, you can take the high road or the low road, right? You can meet it or collapse out of it, or um, retreat or advance. And so there's a yeah. So I wanted to speak into that. So I frame it in terms of that, in terms of a war in heaven, in terms of a contest between the better angels of our nature
right,
and the other possibilities that are within us, that are darker, right? That are selfish, that would respond to crisis with violence and uh, spreading ignorance instead of clarity.
right,
So, so that was some of it, and then I focused particularly on the moment as a crisis in learning, or
Can we
an
come,
educational crisis. Yeah,
if
please.
possible, Zach, we'll come to that because that's a big part of it, of course. But I want to just get clear on the title and what exactly you're you're implying by it. It's called a war in heaven. Now, you've already mentioned the new sphere, and you've spoken a little bit about our better natures and worse natures, battles between maybe angels and demons comes to mind. Maybe the Manichaean heresy comes to mind. Old biblical stories come to mind. I'm trying to figure out how literally we should understand this notion of a battle in heaven. Clearly, it's not entirely literal, and yet I don't think it's entirely figurative either. So I'm just trying to get a feeling for where you are on that.
That's an interesting question. I would follow James Hillman, who's a great Jungian psychologist, who basically say you almost never want to literalize anything. But that doesn't mean that things aren't real. It just means that you can't even take literal things literally.
Give me an example. Yeah, it sounds good.
Like a chess piece is an interesting example, right? Something that is, when it sits on the table, it's literally a chess piece, but it's not actually just that, especially if it's a particular one, right? So there's a layer of abstraction that the human puts upon all things, and it changes them out of the literal and into, let's say, the imaginal or the psychologized, right? It's being tended to with human awareness. And so the basic idea is that, I'm not suggesting in it like a fundamentalist Christian or a strange new age person who believes in whatever complex metaphysical ontology that they picked up last week at a weekend workshop, that this is something that's much richer, metaphorical and archetypal mythic language that I'm trying to tap into. Because the eschatological and the apocalyptic and those kinds of imaginal vistas have been part of humanity for as long as there's been humanity. So this is one of the things humans do, is imagine in that direction, right? Imagine in the direction of the world changing fundamentally, turning over entirely. So there's a rich symbolism there that is deep in the psyche, which needs to be put on the table and part of a reasonable conversation, right? Instead of having the reasonable conversations push that stuff to the margins, and then some of the most loaded, significant architecture within our mind and the imagination becomes subject to basically being co-opted by the most irrational forces, right? So we need to have extremely reasonable things to say about the most profound questions of the moment, instead of placing some of the most profound questions into some container of like stuff that's not kosher to talk about because it's not scientific, or it's not simply about causality, right?
So right.
Mm-hmm.
I think I understand you. I'm just wondering what you would say to someone who felt that the way you were describing, I mean, in the actual language you use, if you just give me a second to quote yourself back at you, you say, this is it. We have arrived at the end of the world. Finally, now we can start to build a new one. This is our chance to reshape ourselves as spiritual, scientific, and ethical beings. So strong, fighting talk, as they say. And I'm just curious about someone who, might say, well, this sounds like the dawning of the age of Aquarius again. What is distinct about this moment for you? In what sense, if this is a feature of human nature, that we have these larger schematic, imaginal dispositions or feelings or inclinations that are always somehow there, but they tend to be pushed aside. How is what's happening now with the coronavirus different from a prior sense of it's the end of the world as we know it? And I won't say I feel fine, but you know what I mean?
Right.
What is distinct about this from what's happened before?
Yeah, it's an important question. And there's a few ways to think about it. One is that in prior history, in prior contexts where humans were thinking about these things, they were thinking about them in civilizations that were not of planetary scope. Right? They were thinking about them in contexts where, if they were portending with their imagination the collapse of their civilization, it would be local, and it wouldn't actually literally be the collapse of the entire support system for human life on the planet, right? And so that's one mode where it's unique, which is that, yes, in fact, we are in a civilization that's become so complex that you can't have a localized collapse, right? That it's not us in China, that if either one of those collapse, the whole thing goes down. And that, so that's one way it's different. That if you take it out of just the imagination and into the literal, which if you're in a society that looks like it's nearing its end, that didn't used to be as catastrophic. It was catastrophic locally, but it wasn't catastrophic on a planetary level.
So
we are looking at a situation since World War II, right? Since the bomb,
right,
when there's been this awakening in human consciousness of the possibility of self-inflicted extinction of the species. And
the Cold War would be, the main example of that, I suppose. There was a time we both grew up in where in the back of our minds there was this threat of the world being stupid enough to destroy itself.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to tease out. This is planetary, but so was the Cold War.
Right. So that's only one way, right? So the other way, and I mentioned this in my paper, and I get into it in more depth in my book, which is that if you look at it from an economic perspective, or from the perspective of someone who would study the history of civilization in terms of technology or in terms of bureaucracy, right? You're also seeing trends at the level of what's called the world system, right, like Emanuel Wallerstein. You're seeing trends where there's reason to believe that, yes, new economic functions need to come into place soon, right? That the model of pure extraction from the environment, that you're trying to get limited resources on an infinite timeline, like those kinds of notions, limits of growth I mentioned in the paper, that we've been seeing not from any esoteric angle, but from a concrete system science, economics, like ecology angle, that this world, as it were, the world system, is nearing its limits, that it cannot go on like this in perpetuity. And so in another sense, in a much less esoteric sense, we've been seeing for a long time the fragility and the kind of unsustainable patterns within the civilization that would suggest something abrupt may force us to change the nature of the civilization so fundamentally that it appears to be a new kind of civilization. And so it's not the apocalypse in any, although those terrible scenarios are possible. There is a possibility, as happens in individuals when you become a new person, like this is a new civilization. And so when you look at what's cascading and what could possibly cascade on the coronavirus in relation to the other things that were already in play, a la limits of growth, right? Then you're seeing the situation where, the beginning of the beginning of the transition into something that's so fundamental, that's new. That's new, that could be new in a good way, or new in a bad way. And so that's such a big good and bad, and the space is so potentiated that's why this notion of the war in heaven as a metaphor resonates, basically, as I see it.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, the world system was already teetering. The sort of the business as usual model was already reaching its natural limits, its material limits, and with that, perhaps coextensive with that, were sort of cultural and even spiritual limits, the capacity to make sense of a world that's effectively destroying itself.
Right.
And in that unstable matrix arises something tiny, but tiny and powerful enough to move this entire system into a different kind of state. And that's what makes it when you say the beginning of the end, the world is ending finally, you're saying we've been waiting for this moment for a long time.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And it's not the new age dawning of the age of Aquarius. I mean, these are serious economists and, ecologists and psychologists and others who've been saying since 72, as I point out in the paper, like, this thing can't go on like this. And so you imagine the metaphor, another metaphor, if you have like a a workaholic, overworked alcoholic who is stressed out of their mind, just barely trying to pay rent, deep in debt, right? Now imagine that as a country,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then that country gets sick.
Yeah, sure.
And then that person, like we're so stretched thin in so many vectors, and trying to sustain something that can't be sustained, that, a bug in the system has profound impacts. And so there's a way in which crisis in that situation can allow a person to repattern their habits to become more healthy in the long term, even though the short-term crisis is extremely bad and painful. So it's a difficult situation to look at because there is so much suffering just on the street now. And so when I'm saying these things like, oh yeah, this is maybe something that will help us in the long run, it's like, it's very difficult to even say that because of how concrete the suffering is right now for so many people. So I'm not trying to trivialize that, but I am trying to suggest that this is a very serious moment. And so in that sense, we need to think about the identity and about the ethical implications and about who we're becoming as people, as much as we're thinking about fixing it, solving it, which we need to think about. And it's precisely because the measures we will take to fix and solve it are so powerful, and they will be unprecedentedly powerful interventions into lives, that we need to think so carefully also about the ethical and the nature of personhood and these things. So that balance is also part of what I think I'm calling for in the paper.
Okay. So I want to come to the rich psychological and educational and spiritual features that you raise in a moment, but I want to just put a word in for the sort of optimist here, maybe the delusional optimist even, but to someone who says, look, let's imagine Steven Pinker with his allies in the room saying, look, humanity has made formidable progress. Millions are coming out of poverty all the time. Literacy is better than ever. Infant mortality is lower. We're making these advances in science, technology. Yes, there's a big ecological crisis, but there's reason to believe we may have technological solutions there. And this virus, while it's very inconvenient, is a short-term blip that we can deal with through the measures we're using and return to something like normal. And for them, normal is not a state of crisis or emergency, but a civilization that's made significant progress. What do you say to that kind of person, bearing in mind that, we're not naive, right? They've got their own view of the world grounded in research too. So what is your answer to that?
Right. I think Bob Marley said in a lyric something like, well, if I'm wrong.
Bob Marley's your answer to Steve Pinker.
That's my answer. Yeah. He said something like, I saw a philosopher once say Bob Marley is one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, but I'll put those aside. Well, if I'm wrong, then everything is all right. Right. So that would be my response, which is that, I don't see the same data sets in the way that these guys are seeing them. So there's that prior argument, which is we need to talk about what world are we actually living in? Mm-hmm. What history are we actually telling? Are we seeing that? So first I could have that conversation with them. And there's a lot of intricacies there. But the first thing I would say is, listen, I hope you're right. Like in a sense, I hope that the over cautiousness and the concern that I have about the nature of our civilization is me being overreacting or having a personal agenda, or there's some distortion and that you guys are seeing it crystal clearly and that somehow you're not distorted, right? Like we have psychological biases, which these guys I'm sure are aware of. Normal, like a normalization bias and a positive self-attribution bias and a whole bunch of things that would make the view that they have seem to be the one that's more naive than the view that says, well, wait, let's look critically at this. So I would say, listen, I hope you're right. If you want to have a longer discussion about those historical arguments.
That's an empirical and
or then we could talk about that,
yeah.
and we could say where are we actually? And I think there's a lot of things that simply are not discussed by that group of that kind of archetype you're painting, the kind of person who has better angels of nature like on their coffee table and like bats on it to comfort themselves, like that person. There's a lot of things that they're simply not aware of because
of course they would say so. It's likewise with the guy who thinks that Bob Marley was the greatest philosopher.
I didn't say that. I said someone said that.
I'm not sort of consciously taking a side on this issue, but what I am aware of, and I think is fairly indisputable, is that the calls for transformation of the kind that you raise in your recent essay arise in a world where many people are in a make, do, and mend kind of mentality. Make, do, mend, and tally-ho, carry on. So whoever is sort of right in their diagnosis there, they have to coexist at some level. So I guess I just wanted to sort of hold that as a kind of a question that may well be persuasively answered by you. I'm almost certain it could be, and my own inclination is towards the sense that we're at a very, very fragile moment where civilization could implode. But I just want to put a word in for the alternative view, which would be nice if they turn out to be right. But when you call for transformation, Zak, it's quite specific, and I think to some a little bit surprising, because you use the word education as if, of all the kinds of crisis this is, some see it as an economic crisis, a political crisis, clearly a medical crisis, and it's a food crisis. There's many different aspects to it. But you come along and say, look, don't underestimate, in some ways, the biggest crisis of all here is educational. So two things. What does that mean, and why use that term to express it?
I define education, I think, much more broadly than most people define education. And I define it in kind of a Deweyan sense, where almost all the infrastructures of society are educational, and almost all of who you are is a result of education.
Tell me a little more. Take some time on that, because I think that's a key idea that isn't widely appreciated.
Yeah,
it may not be possible to get that idea out without the word education. So just tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, essentially I break it down in terms of the difference between schooling and education, right? And that education has been a basic social function in human societies for many thousands of years before there were schools.
Right.
And there's many forms of education that we know about, obviously, that take place outside of schools. Mm-hmm. And so I just prefer to focus on this term education as being this very broad term, which has to do basically with intergenerational transmission, kind of writ large across all of the infrastructures and relationships that are possible in a society. So that the TV is educational, right? The internet is educational, for better and for worse, is kind of the point. And this is what Dewey was saying, was that, democracy is a way of life. And what he meant by that was that way of life needs to be continually educational across all the infrastructures of the society, that we're always in a position to learn and to teach, not simply to be consuming and interacting, if I can kind of use those words as part of a third person system view. Yeah. So in that sense, education for me is a deep kind of anthropologically important aspect, like a species specific trait of the human. This is Michael Tomasello's work, differentiating what's the difference between a monkey and a 3-year-old, or a 4-year-old, what is really the difference between the human and the animal. And one of the things he focused on,
cultural psychology, right?
Correct. Yeah. He was at the Max Planck Institute, and fascinating experimental paradigms, just showing very concretely in terms of the complexity of perspective taking and other things. But the main thing is that he didn't put it this way, but this is the implication, is that it's the teaching and the learning that the humans do are different, that there's a concerted effort to educate in the complex cultural realms. So only much later, and specifically during modernity, did we get schooling as we know it, as a specific social institution, as that's the place where education happens. Okay. Right. And so I want to disentangle that. And then you can also disentangle schooling from learning. Right. And so then you can actually say that Well, you could hate schools, but love education and learning and have massive opportunity for education and learning outside of school.
Yeah.
And you could have a school where very little education is taking place and very little learning is taking place. And so if you disentangle those concepts, then you're allowed to say something like this is an educational crisis, right? It's also a crisis of the schools, for sure.
Right.
But at a deeper level, we weren't prepared for this across many capacity domains within the self and within the culture. That and now, as the task demands of meeting the crisis become more complex,
right,
we face an educational demand, not just in schools, with all adults from all walks of life, to build new capacities. I mean, hand washing being an interesting example, but it's going to get more complicated. Just what are the new things we need to onboard and become to deal with the situation? And so in that sense, it is a crisis in the schools, but more broadly, it's an educational crisis and a crisis of identity and capacity.
Okay, let me just try and clarify this point as far as I can. So you've mentioned that before, that the distinction between technology, culture, and education is breaking down, or has completely broken down, arguably, which might mean that the relationship between formal education of schooling, the kind of informal education of being in a family and being with friends and being out on the street, and then the kind of tacit education you might get from, say, playing the guitar, or what you pick up from your smartphone and so forth. These are all within the educational kind of domain. What you're saying that's a little bit different, I think, is that we tend to associate education with schools principally, but you're saying that there's always a kind of cultural task demand going on. Some of that is implicit in what we receive, some of that's explicit, as in now when the government's given instructions to behave in certain ways. But there's something in this that's a little bit hard to get a feeling for, which is that your notion of intergenerational transmission being quite important for education. The reason that feels meaningful is that somehow you're connecting the psychological, epistemic, past-based skills of a person to the social, economic, and cultural infrastructure of the whole society. And you're saying that the relationship between those things is what really matters, rather than what we think of as the kind of mind gas pump model of getting some learning inside it. You're saying, when you say educational crisis, you mean something much more like where system meets soul, or system meets soul meets society, to use Perspectiva's language. But that's roughly what you mean, I think. Or correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right. And this gets to the work we're doing with the Transformative Education Alliance and the Fourfold crisis of education, where you're seeing it as...
Just share that with for the people who don't know that.
So we've got the notion of the meaning crisis being the one that gets so much discussion. We can start there. That the way we're talking about education here is this broader kind of like rift in the intergenerational and skill transmission fabric of the society, which then makes it hard for people to assume roles within that society with enough capacity and wherewithal because they didn't get the transmission. So that where the system meets soul, as you're saying, is a good way to put it. How do we capacitate people in a disruption? Have four components at least, and this is our model, which is that one is the meaning crisis. That part of what allows the system to meet the soul, right, and what allows civilization to work is that the people within it have a sense that their lives are meaningful, in part because of their participation in the system. That the system itself they want to see exist in perpetuity, and they can give to it with willingness. And so right now there's a fracture in the ability to do that. That David Graeber, right? Bullshit jobs, right? That our contribution to the system feels not meaningful. So that's one, like Vervaeke's work is in that domain. We also have a capabilities crisis, and this is what I was just speaking to. So there's also, outside of the ability to make meaning out of your contribution and existence, there's the ability to do the things that need to be done at the level of capacity. So do we know how to staff an emergency room, right? Do we know how to run those systems? Do we have good teachers teaching us how to do that, right? do we know how to run a nuclear power plant, right? Do we know how to run a highway system? Like these basic tasks that our civilization are now dependent upon are actually really high up a capacity stack in human development, which means basically we have to, from now on, if we want to have a civilization like this, have an educational system or something that gets people really, really smart about really intricate details of technical problems that keep the society going.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start to break some of the other things in the intergenerational transmission and skill thing, then you could get people not capacitated enough. And so like, wait, why isn't the supply chain working for the hospitals? Why isn't the food system already anti-fragile? It is in part because of a capacity deficit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that one.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's also eligibility. Yep. An intelligibility crisis, and this is a sense-making crisis. So not about can you get the job done, do you have the capacity, not about is it meaningful, but about do we know what's going on, right, as a society? Are we able to see objectively what is the case? And so you can start to get breakdowns in the ability for the younger generation and the older generation to see reality together. And even within generations, that you and your colleagues and peers are seeing reality, that there's a common sense, right? If that breaks down, then we're in another kind of educational crisis that's fixed in a different way than fixing meaning or fixing capability. And then the final one being legitimacy. And so this is about power, the distribution of power and authority. And so another thing that keeps the society running is people interfacing with power and with the dynamics that hold together political systems and hold together agreements and contracts and hold together systems of epistemological authority within disciplines. And so there can be a breakdown in the legitimacy structures as well, which are part of the educational fabric of a society, is to reproduce the legitimation of that society, that it is a good thing to participate in, that power is wielded and ought to be by the people who have it. So those are the four, and that's another way of saying, yeah, it's not just about STEM skills in school. That's not what education is, right? It's not just about school lunches and stuff. Like that is in part what school reform is about. But what education is about is the full intergenerational fabric of the civilization, and is it reproducing itself at a level of complexity to keep that civilization going? And so that's what I mean by education. And so when I say we're in an educational crisis now, I mean that. I mean across all those dimensions.
And likewise with the civilization teetering because of world systemic issues, and then suddenly being heightened because of the virus. Similarly, the educational system failing to meet the complexity of the time fundamentally in terms of its schooling and its formal institutions. And now, as a result of this virus, education more broadly conceived, as you've put it, is again facing an even more acute, profound, time-sensitive challenge.
Correct. Yeah. And I'm actually, even though I'm defining education this way, I don't want to say that the schools aren't a big deal. I actually spent a ton of time researching the state of the schools. And in part, the breakdown of the modern educational model, again, around after 1972, but actually getting closer to the 90s, you started to see that this way of organizing schooling wasn't enough for a society that was developing technologically at the pace that our society was developing. Goldstein and Katz, I think it is, something like The Race Between Education and Technology or something in the book by some economists, basically seeing this. So there, for a while, there'd been a sense that, these schools aren't enough, and that actually they're fragile and they're not. And so I could tell another argument, which is, saying, one of the reasons our civilization is as precarious as it is right now, and is because the schools for a couple decades haven't been keeping up. And that's, I think, not because of the fault of frontline people within schools. I think teachers are actually the reason that it's been successful at all. The giving of the teacher and their intimate relationships with students and the details of that richness, that's what keeps the school system going. But there's a misconception at the level of the policy, like standardized testing, for example, and even at the level of infrastructure with the huge high schools and the factory-like routines that are still in place in some situations. So yeah, please.
Well, just I want to bring it back a little bit to the virus, because we've zoomed deep and out in a way that was necessary to give context to what you've written. But just to bring it back slightly, if I were a tabloid journalist, Zak, I would ask you a question like, okay, you've critiqued modern day education, and we understand you've put a good word in for schools, but now that schools are closed, is there a case for keeping them closed and rebuilding from scratch? How would you begin to answer that?
I mean, I can only speak to the situation in the United States, and I certainly would never suggest building from scratch, right? Like, the dedicated educators in the public school system in the United States, are a massive capacity pool. Like, there's a ton of people in there who know how to work with kids and how to teach. So it wouldn't be about starting from scratch. It would actually be about making somewhat common sense alterations to the existing practice and systems that would take more full advantage of basically the digital, and more full advantage of the emergence of a kind of, let's call it a post-work economic situation, even if a temporary one. We're looking at millions upon millions upon millions of people flooding into unemployment claims within the United States, and many of those people have children. So in order to do anything like I'm recommending, we would also need something like a basic income guarantee and adjacent opportunities for adult education that would allow for a transformation of the dynamic of education to contain more parental involvement and more individuation and a different kind of curriculum. And so the vision I have for the Educational Hub Network in my book, it's not a vision where each kid's alone in their house looking at a screen. Like, that's not the idea. The idea is to have the school be more like a community center with a ton of parental involvement and a ton of involvement from people who are now called teachers, who would have a much more sophisticated role in society, which would be to coordinate with families and coordinate pop-up classrooms, rethinking the strict modalities and bureaucracies of the factory school to open up the walls and to allow for a time and skill sharing network among parents and teachers and professionals and communities, and to make the entire kind of system different. But it would require not just changing school policy, it would require changing labor policy, healthcare policy, a bunch of things to basically make the child or the task of education one of the focal points of the whole kind of like virus relief package, let's call it, where part of the rebooting would be essentially refocusing. Instead of bailing out the large businesses and the finance organizations, we would actually literally bail out at the level of the community and the child in the direction of education, repurposing the schools and freeing the parents and educating the parents. So it's something more like that than a pure reboot. And then the argument would also include the criticisms of the existing school. So it's not just what would be possible and how enticing the new vision. It's also, look how poorly what we already had was working for so many.
Yes.
Right. And that's an argument that I make in both of my books. It's a hard argument to make because I love schools in a sense, and they helped me so much. And the American public schools are actually a very inspiring institution. And so I'm actually kind of like saying, in the name of the public schools that once were, we need to refashion this system in a time of crisis to do what those schools did when we were leaving pre-modernity, right? To do now for the modern people as we enter something new, a new form of education. So that would be if you were tabloid, then I would give you my visionary response.
And I would put a headline on, like, Zak says, do not start from scratch, or schools must stay open, says Dr. Stein, or something like that. But I want to speak for the last 20 to 30 minutes on the more spiritual aspects of the piece you wrote. But as a bridge to that, you already mentioned something interesting about the reason civilization perhaps hasn't yet collapsed and things have stayed afloat is something about the active ingredient in educational intergenerational transmission being quality relationships, often through teachers and students, but not just that, other forms of education happening in different ways. I mention this because when I asked people what I might pose to you today, one person said, look, I teach at university, and my impression is that all the good work I do comes in the form of kind of quality of a relationship. It's almost entirely about how much I'm connecting with a given person. And that is the kind of active ingredient that stays with them and that makes me feel valued and helps them get on in life. But we're not taught how to do that, and we're not encouraged to do that, and it's not part of explicitly what they're supposed to be doing. And I just wondered, in this moment, coming back to March 2020, when everyone is thinking quite hard about their relationships, who they can help, what they need, what really matters to them, how they can be there for people, is there anything we can do from that sensibility that would allow us to move towards the kind of systemic change you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, that's the number one thing we actually are called to do now, is to care for one another, basically, and to do that through open communication. And so I know a lot of teachers now in the K-12 system in the States who are just working their asses off to support the families and the kids. And that's about doing this. It's about long form Zoom calls, telephone calls, being there for people. And it may seem like that's not what your job is, or it may even seem like you're being discouraged from doing that. But in fact, this is what the moment requires. And it also, even more so, in family systems. And it's true that work needs to continue to go on and people need to work from home. And it's difficult to do that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there's work being done right now between us, which is off the books, right? Yeah. Which isn't counted in the spreadsheets and the productivity reports, which is work that needs to happen.
But the thing is, like, that's true in general, right? I mean, that's true of unpaid labor in general, of caring labor in general.
Correct.
Things that don't show up on GDP metrics, the informal economy, all that kind of stuff, that the kind of dark matter of the world that the policymakers act as if it's not there, and yet people who live know that that's where it's at.
Yep.
But if you don't mind, I want to just, because of time, and I know that what the punchers are looking for is a little bit more on some of the spiritual aspects of your piece. So I want to quote to you this quite challenging but profound paragraph where you say, spiritual pilgrims get real. Mm-hmm. And you say, for those identifying as spiritual or religious, yes, this is why you've been sitting on the mat, praying and working on yourself. But the liminal may require you to re-examine your ideas concerning reality, especially the notion that you create your own. Likewise, if you balked at my use of the terms good and evil or up or down, you are likely struggling to make sense of anything right now. Socially constructed realities are exactly what begins to slip away when biology obliges you to enter the liminal. So there's a lot there, but I guess I want to get at the underlying spirit of this and what lies behind this statement, because you're speaking directly to sort of spiritual practitioners, and you're saying, be careful somehow. You're saying, is what you've been doing what you think you've been doing, or something like that? Tell me more.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this was in part, that paragraph was part of why I wrote the whole paper, basically, because I'd been seeing certain content online coming from spiritual leaders, basically, who were saying things that, well, let's just say you couldn't have said those things on a hospital ward in Italy, right? You couldn't have said them on a hospital ward in Italy, that your karma brought this to you, that we need to thank the virus, that there is no such thing as a virus, that disease is part of the fiction of the world you create with your own imagination and mind. And these things can work on the podium, in the abstract, and in the armchair. But, that rehearsal is over, and we need to find things to say that get in touch with reality and with people's hearts. So I was kind of like a little bit appalled that, in fact, the overtly relativistic and you create your reality, new age spiritual messaging was being received so well. In part because I thought Ken Wilber completely destroyed it in the 90s for good, but also in part because now is not the time for that. Now's the time to speak at a different register and to speak to those people who are suffering, not those people who are trying to protect their minds from worry. And so, it's a different kind of discourse that needs to be engaged in. And it's not a spirituality of ecstasis or a spirituality of thoughtless awareness. It's a spirituality of the heart and of care and compassion, which is, So I'm trying to change the tone a little bit and get people to think about that. Could you say this on a hospital ward in Italy? Now, someone who has suffered, someone who has been sick with the virus and who recovers and then says, I want to thank the virus because it made me reassess my life. Beautiful. They're allowed to say that. But from a distance with a camera crew and like for promotional purposes, it's hard.
You're pulling your punches here a bit, right? I have a sense there's some rage lying beneath it.
It's just, when you look at the great religious traditions, you have, obviously things that people can critique, but you also have a kind of moral courage and a kind of willingness to co-suffer with the world.
Compassion, literally, right?
Compassion, and to participate in a selfless manner. And there are techniques in those traditions which can create ecstasis and which can alleviate, anxiety through the control of thought and the control of experience. And those are important, but there's this whole other ethical dimension in discourse, which was always a prerequisite for doing any of those other practices. Usually was having basically, that stuff down first, and then you could go and do these other practices. And so we've reversed that in the West often, especially in America, I think. And so, there's an anger at the disrespect, basically, that's being given to the elders who knew what it meant to really live and die and suffer. And so, I think that's some of what it's coming from. And so the hope is that there can be a shifting towards more sane way of speaking about this among those people who would like to say things that are deep and profound and spiritual and that alleviate suffering. So the impetus to say something that heals the mind and heart, I share.
Yes.
But the medicine needs to be the right medicine, right? And so, following like Gaffney, other biblical scholars, right? You look at Job's comforters, right? Story of Job. Like, who comes to Job? They try to comfort Job, right? Job's suffering, poor bad. And they come, and there's all these different theodicies, all these different ways to explain the evil and the suffering. And Job's like, get the fuck out of my face, man. You don't know what you're talking about. And then God agrees with Job. God's like, yeah, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. And you don't understand that you don't understand. And that's some of it too, is that it's like, we don't fully understand what's taking place. There's a complexity and tragedy to the world that's there. And so that's some of what I see with these kind of tone deaf kind of spiritual responses, is this need for control, this need to have a way to understand or to have a way to not understand, right? When in fact, to look at it for what it is requires a different mind. And and that kind of looking I'm describing, there's just you have to help. If you're looking at it correctly, you have to help to move forward with compassion, not to look away with
Right.
aversion, right? That's the way we have to
This-
look at this, which is looking out of love, right?
Mhm.
As opposed to fear. And so that's some of what was in that paragraph.
So I'm not sure how much you use it in this particular piece, but you've spoken elsewhere and written elsewhere about the kind of post-tragic sensibility,
Right.
Which is a term that isn't that easy to digest if you haven't come across it before. So it sounds a little bit like what you're describing as post-tragic, perhaps. There's something about going beyond the sense that you can fix this, and yet it's not bereft of hope. There's also a sense of there's meaningful work to be done nonetheless, and there's meaningful elevation to be had, or meaningful transformation to be had, but only by going. There's no way around but through. You have to kind of go through the tragedy first.
Right.
Tell me a little more about that term, post-tragic, and how you're using it.
Yeah, that comes out of the kind of integral diaspora with me and Gaffney and Ken Wilber and others who were thinking about a very complex way of modeling what happens when people are involved in religious practice and spirituality and things of that nature. And so you've got stages of development, which we all know and love. And you've got states of consciousness, which we know as well. But then you have these stations of the self, let's say, which is different, right? The pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic.
Mm-hmm.
Those aren't like developmental levels like Hansi Freinock or spiral dynamics or something like that. And they're not states of consciousness. They're stations, more like Ericksonian or, Harry Stack Sullivan, where it's this whole way that the personality or identity is dealing with life. And so the pre-tragic is what it sounds like, right? It's before the expulsion from the garden. And there's a sense that the world owes you a living, and there's no sense of injustice, no sense of fear, etc. And for many people, the only time you have that is in childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, that can last for a very long time. The tragic, again, is an inevitable station in life. And it's not that people escape life without tragedy. It's that we navigate them. And so the tragedy is what it sounds like. This is those times that I described earlier when the world comes in upon you and you're in the constellation of relationships or material interactions where there's just like an immovable difficulty that's going to change the nature of your identity, put it in crisis. And so the tragic is a station. You can be in the tragic for your whole life. For most of your life, you can stay in the tragic. This happens. This is, and it's not necessarily a matter of material circumstance, although it can be, right? That some people are born into tragedy, as it were.
Yes.
But even with those people born into tragedy, there is the option of moving to the post-tragic, which doesn't mean leaving the tragic situation at all, actually. Often it means you found a way to live within a tragically constellated situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important. So as you leave the pre-tragic to the tragic and you're entering tragedy, the main response is to want to go back to the pre-tragic to find a way for it actually not to be a tragedy, right? Well, it's not a tragedy. Their karma brought it to them. It's not a tragedy. That's their path, right? It's not a tragedy. The correct response is actually to move through the tragedy and to be post-tragic within and surrounded by tragedy. And again, now we're back to the archetypes and ideals of the religious tradition. This is the vision you see, the bodhisattva burning in the fire of samsara with clear awareness, right? The saint, right, in the midst of a plague or something. And so, the post-tragic is a different relationship to the tragedy, not an absence of tragedy.
Right.
And so it's not about fixing, right? The pre-tragic also wants to fix whatever the thing is that's causing the tragedy, desperately fix it. So it's not a tragedy. Whereas the post-tragic is saying, well, we have to watch this, like tragedy is real. Sometimes it can't be fixed. And
so this reminds me of Christian friends telling me that one way to get a grip on the Easter story is that even within the story, it goes that when Jesus was resurrected and appeared, he was still wounded. So it's not as though everything had been solved. There was still a sense in which he'd undergone that the sacrifice and the suffering was real. And it makes me think of the Bodhisattva coming back into the market with open arms, as it were. He comes with open arms, but the market itself may not be in good health. You know, it might be that it's lots of people are going bankrupt, and it doesn't follow that because you're willing to contribute and help that somehow you can make everything okay. You're coming back into it in all its tension and difficulty. So a related thought to this, Zak, that really intrigued me, and it was a similar kind of move in some ways. There's something very intriguing for me about the biology of all this. Like, I feel as though my reaction to this crisis has been something like, the way I've experienced it has been as if biology took on a kind of archetypal form and said, don't forget about me, you know, I'm here too. Like, hi guys, you know, you need me. That's for lots of reasons. One is that I'm type 1 diabetic, and, you know, I'm somewhat more vulnerable to the virus. But it's not just that. It's also that we tend to think that the biology is something you escape from, and then you move into these sort of social and cultural and psychological realms, and you go from them higher up somehow into the spiritual realms. But there's something beautiful about the current situation that connects very profoundly the biological with the spiritual in a way that calls into question the social and cultural. And I just wondered what that's all about, because you seem like the kind of person who might help me understand it.
That's very interesting. And you're right, there is a general sense that we're moving into something that's like post-historical, post-biological, kind of postmodern, and where we are not localized and ecologized. We're not encased in an ecosystem in any way, and we're not even in our bodies with these weird imaginations of like being able to move between bodies with like brain transplants or uploads or things. So we are definitely thinking along the lines you're saying, that we're somehow post-biological. And then you also have, again, the spiritual crowd up and out, right? Up and out of the biology. And in fact, spirituality means perfect control of the biology, so illness doesn't exist, right? That they're moving post-biological. That's what it means to be spiritual, is to not have a body. When of course, that's all kind of gibberish. I think that in fact there's a deep reality to the body, and that's, again, the tragic structure of life. Right. You're going to die.
Right.
You're going to die. The main reason you're going to die is because you have a body. That's a biological organism that has these things built into it, right? Which we are now currently trying to tinker with, right? Yep. But which are built into it, which says death is a part of life, right? That's what these things say. And so, yeah, confrontation with the biological is a confrontation with the limits of the socially constructed and the limits of the imagination. Mm-hmm. And that's a confrontation with, again, reality, right? Mm-hmm. And there's lessons there, death being one of them. Right? Mm-hmm. It's not socially constructed. Death is not socially constructed reality.
No, not usually.
It's a biological reality, and I think a spiritual reality. Yeah. And so what we're looking at is, this moment, and it often happens in people's lives, that it's something physical that creates the metanoia, mm-hmm. right? Something physical that creates the transformation of identity and illness and injury, right. An experience of being embodied in nature, sexuality. Like, it's these things that allow us to become aware of our right. unique position in space and time and biology, right? So yes, there's
so
this,
in the chat I had with Andrew Sweeney, I brought this up, that when I did the spirituality work back at the RSA, one of the bits of research that intrigued me the most was research on post-traumatic growth, which often arose from near-death experiences of one kind or the other, either an accident or an illness, where people would suddenly sort of come to themselves and say, I've been living a life I don't really want to live. And then the turn tends to be from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic, broadly conceived. So less about status and money and fame, more about relationships and craft purposes and creative pursuits and so forth. But what's weird about that, I always felt, was that these people do these things because they encountered their own deaths,
right?
Very palpably. And yet what's bizarre is that they already knew they were going to die, right? So there's something odd about it. It's as if the world has to remind us mm-hmm. that we're mortal, and we have to feel it biologically and emotionally before we can change in a meaningful way. And I feel that's sort of happening at the moment. There's suddenly biology is saying, remember me. And people are saying, biology, aren't you friends with mortality? Mortality. I should do something about that. You know, there's something like this going on. So that came to mind. But I also didn't want to forget something, because I'm thinking in my mind of who's potentially watching. The developmental crowd will have been very intrigued by a reference to stations, because many will be familiar with the idea of developmental stages. Others will be familiar with the idea of states of consciousness. And we also have streams in Wilbur. But stations is relatively new language. And you seem to, and you're not talking about cultural code either. So there seems to be something distinct about this language that is fairly original. So I know you've already said it, but is there anything you can add to that to really nail that point?
Right, totally. Let me say one thing about post-traumatic growth first, though, which is that's a very good frame to understand what's happening at a civilisational and cultural level, right? That actually, this is a very traumatic experience, akin to like a world war or something. And what that means is that it's going to hurt like hell, but there will be unprecedented potentials for new growth as a result of it. And so, and that's true in individuals, and it's remarkable at a neurological level, right? The kind of neuroplasticity that comes in during the recovery from trauma, if environmental situations and everything is correct, that it's true that people can become new people and better people than they were. So that's very important for reframing of what this is. It's like, yes, this is a collective trauma, but it's also a collective potentiating for post-traumatic growth. And so that's worth noting. And then the stations. So the first time I heard the stations language is long ago, like 2000, with Martin Matusik, who is a Habermasian scholar who was in dialogue with Ken Wilber. And then that language became part of the integral kind of theory conference crowd in the 2000s. And since that time, I've been using it as a kind of working language within the group at the Center for Integral Wisdom, moving towards a book that will eventually be published called In a Unique Voice, which is applying integral theory and unique self-theory to the developmental problems. And so the stations, the notion of stations, again, it's a different way of understanding the many facets and dimensions of development, that it's not simply cognitive, it's not simply perspective taking, and it's not simply something you do in isolation. The stationing has to do with kind of thresholds of maturity that it require life conditions to be met, right? So just like to do high-level calculus, you need to interact with calculus problems to move through the stages, to move through these stations, pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic. And then there are other stations, which I don't feel super comfortable getting into because I haven't really thought about this in a long time. I wasn't expecting to go with this, but we'll stick with this station. You need to encounter tragedy. So like, if you're not in a tragic situation, you either may want to open your eyes and pay attention and allow yourself to be in one, or B, don't try to create tragedy through intense emotional circling work, right? Don't try to create tragedy by looking at a news feed and becoming traumatized, right? Life will bring to you things that will allow you to mature if you can step into them. And so this is about the stations requiring moving through, right? The stations of the cross come to mind, right? Like you have to literally, you have to walk through the world. Things have to be happening to you. Why they're called
stations? Is that why you chose to call them stations, or whoever?
It's not. It may be why, because Martin Matusik was, I believe he's like existentialist Christian.
Right.
So that may be. This is the first time I've made that association. But it's interesting. But that's what it is. So it's different than ego development, different than cognitive development, different than states, different than types, are the stations, which are universal, but they're not universally distributed. So like some people, as we were saying, like their lives are giving them way more opportunity to deal with tragedy than others, right? And so that means that they could become an incredibly mature post-tragic person, or they could be basically crushed by their life.
Yeah.
And that's just real. And so that's like, why was I born me and they were born them? Like, we have to think about that. And then the people who are without tragedy, or ostensibly without tragedy, they don't have the opportunity to mature like that. So what does that mean?
So I'm wondering, if, to bring it back to the earlier parts of the conversation, there's two things that come to mind. One is, it makes me wonder if the kind of empirical optimists by nature are sort of pre-tragic. And also there's something about pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic that's very much not developmental in the hierarchical sense. It's much more horizontal somehow.
Yeah, you can get kids. I mean, you can get young kids who are not on the other metrics, super abstract and complex, and they're not, and you shouldn't think of them, but they've been through tragedy and they've dealt with it, and there's a maturity there.
Very intriguing. But I'm also thinking that one of the ways of thinking of it in the current context is, it's not clear if what's happening now is best characterized as a tragedy. It's more like a crisis.
Right. Correct.
Although the relationship between crisis and tragedy is kind of interesting, because the crisis could become a tragedy, right?
Right. Well, and the tragedy is playing out at the individual level. So at the societal level, it's a crisis.
Right.
The tragedies are happening in the living rooms and the kitchens and nursing homes and the hospital wards. And like, it's the tragedies, it's deeply personal. And
right. So, it's subjective, not intersubjective somehow. It's
subjective, and it can become intersubjective, and that's a very intense situation. But most of it's that really personal stuff, you know, like
so we don't have tragic civilization. The notion of a tragic country or a tragic civilization, does that make sense? Or
I'm not sure, frankly. Like, the idea of a civilization in crisis makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
But the idea of like that the cultural mood is tragic. It could be like when JFK was shot, for example.
Right. Right.
But again, there's the trauma and there's the melodrama, and then there's the actual tragic. And so I think the tragic needs to entangle you at such a deep personal level that you can't wake up tomorrow and be the same person.
I see. You can't shake it off. Right.
Yeah, and shake it off. And so in that sense,
it subsumes you somehow. The notion of tragedy somehow subsumes you in a way that another self is constituted underneath the tragedy. Some stay there, but some manage to. The reason it's interesting for me is it's quite closely connected to post-traumatic growth in some ways. That moving to that station of post-tragic is partly what happens in post-traumatic growth, maybe.
Yeah, well, it is, and when you look at the instruments they use to assess post-traumatic growth, you get things like, I have more connection to my spirituality now. I have more compassion for other people now. I, give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, there's a bunch of things that the people who have the strong post-traumatic growth kind of indices look a lot like what we would describe as post-tragic, right? That they find more humor in life is the one, which is what you find if you ever go to Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, that there's something about certain post-tragic personalities that a new kind of second simplicity and levity is available.
So I'm just thinking of how to best round this off, and looking again at your essay and vis-a-vis what we just spoke about. You've got a lovely paragraph here saying, finding meaning in tragedy is a perennial human task. So we just spoke about that. As is the task of remaking the self. And we just spoke about that a little bit. We must learn to do both while creating a new world. Grief is warranted. Fear is warranted. Pain is inevitable. But insofar as the future matters, learning must become our primary process. Adaptation, evolution, transformation, rebirth, metamorphosis, metanoia, and change. We are in for all of it, and in short order. These are experiences one might seek out for adventure and growth during saner times. Today, they are thrust upon us all. Returning to reality is the nature of the liminal, and reality is relationship, not isolation. So, great. First of all, well done. Beautifully crafted paragraph. I'm just wondering, within that, the term that jumped out to me was metanoia, which is probably the word least familiar to most people in all of that. And it sounds to me like there's something about metanoia that is quite deeply connected to the emphasis on relationship, and quite deeply connected to the combination of dealing with tragedy and learning and creating a new world. So there's a great deal of richness going on there. But I just wonder, a lot of people often wonder, what does this mean for me tomorrow? What does this mean for me when I eventually get back to work, or when we can meet each other again? How do you render some of this rich spiritual philosophical insight into something resembling operational action?
Mm-hmm.
Is that even the right question? I know you sometimes resist that, but
no, I think it is the question that's needed. Right. Like, what's to say? So, I mean, basically, my advice would be to, for the mind to change, for the identity to change, there needs to be space, right? There needs to be care and some time. And so the main recommendation I'm giving to people right now is not abstract philosophical advice. It's mostly like, ease up on the screens if you can, right? Pay attention to long form content like books or audios that are longer than a half an hour, right? And be with people in contexts that are like minimally technologically scaffolded, like board games and cooking and things like that. And make those times important, maybe more important than the time you're spending on your screen if possible. And give yourself space to change. And because, if there's not space for the identity to just kind of like almost behind the scenes reconstitute, and to feel calm, at least as much as calm as you can be, calmer than you would be if you're on the infinite scroll of Facebook, let's say, and to do that. So that's the number one advice that I'm giving. It's not anything abstract or reframing or anything. It's just, this is a time to find a way to almost go back to living like it's the 1980s.
Right. It's a kind of analog imperative somehow.
It's like an analog imperative and the long form imperative, conversations and other things.
So I think I understand that intuitively, but why does long form matter? Why is 1 hour better than 6-10 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, and this is, again, I'm not going to cite neuroscience and cognitive science and stuff, but it just has to do with the role of the fragmentation of attention in mental health, basically. Right. And especially when you're trying to reconstitute very basic patterns and habits and ways of thinking about yourself and things of that nature. There's a reason that therapy session's an hour long, right? Let's say. And there's a reason that in school we have blocks, right, of time. So there's this sense of like a natural cycling, right? And and the other, and so that's important, just a factor. Like, we become habituated to 1,000 miles an hour, all channels open, receiving, like go. That's like, many people have been habituated for that. Yeah. And this is, there's some of that has to go on still, of course, but there will be more opportunity for getting bubbles of protection for the psyche where it can take care of itself and change. And so I realize it sounds like I'm saying you're in isolation, become more isolated. It's actually not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the screen appears like you're out of isolation on the screen, but you're actually not out of isolation. That's the isolation. Be with the things in your room, right?
Let's just get that point. That sounded quite important. The screen is the isolation.
Right.
And I quote you on that. That's a good line.
Yeah, the screen can be the isolation. What we're doing here is different. We're talking for like an hour and a half, right? And we're talking. I'm not just watching, right? And so that's different. But the Facebook and the social media, the endless news feed of mainstream media, all of that stuff is usually consumed at a rate of less than about 5 or 3 minutes per novel item. And so I'm talking about just that fragmentation of attention.
So it's something about the fragmentation of attention combined with the sort of hyper-social nature of it. So hyper-social as opposed to antisocial. It's too social. It's too many voices in your head, too many perspectives to bear, too much information, combined with the way it's chunked, meaning that we can't really process it adequately emotionally.
Right.
And so the analog imperative, as it were, is not to turn your back on the digital world, because we can't do things like this then, but to think hard about the duration and also about the nature of the social interaction.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's just, it's like kind of like a hygiene, you know, it's kind of like there's a time when we're going to be under tremendous pressure. So there's a need to slow down and do those habits. And then, you know, I think, and I'm already seeing it, people are talking more to family than they have in a long time, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think there's a return to more basic commitments at the heart of our personalities than the commitments we have to jobs and material goods and routines that we value. And these things are very important. I'm not saying these things aren't important. I'm saying they're necessary. But I'm saying underneath those, you know, there's a commitment you have to a family member that you would lose your job for, right? You know that there's a commitment you have to your child that you would maybe die for, right? And so there's this issue of an opportunity for remembering those things together, right? That even though we're missing so much, we still have the opportunity to be in those most basic commitments that make us people.
Right.
And, you know, it's, again, now you're back in the domain of the religious, right? You're back into the things that happen around tables where people speak honest truths to one another and recommit to being together, right? And so we have to find a way to allow those things to happen. And that's also why we need space away from screens and space to be together. And it's going to hurt. It's not like those are easy conversations, but I'm saying that's part of what has to happen. As much as we need to fix the economy, as much as we need to stop the virus and do these things, we're also going to need to have these kinds of conversations. And so my sense is that all around the country now, it's not my sense, I actually know that all around the country now, there are groups of therapists and coaches and rabbis and ministers and other people stepping in to do family support, individual support through these means, right? So it's in the coming weeks, maybe even the coming days, you'll be aware that there are people looking to support that dimension of the crisis. That if you're having an unusual problem with your spouse because of the intensity of the situation, that you may be able to actually find someone to talk to now who you never would have been able to find to talk to, right? And so start taking advantage of those opportunities. Admit that this is a serious, crazy situation that warrants doing something weird like talking to a stranger about your emotional problems because it might really help. And so that I'm kind of angling towards like working on the mental health kind of like, again, the metanoia here, that the mind is changing here as much as all our infrastructures and medical systems and ideas about disease and things. So that's another bit of advice there, I think.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for your time, Zach. It's been a great pleasure. And just a reminder for people that the essay Zach wrote is called COVID-19, A War in Heaven, and it's available on the whatisemerging.com website. I'm Jonathan Rowson, Director of Perspectiva, and thanks for watching. But want to say bye, Zach?
Thank you, Jonathan.
This
is great. Bye.